The Cruiser on the right, car 669, is a 2013 Ford Police Interceptor model, which is the Ford's replacement for the Crown Victoria, which has been a staple of police work for many, many years before this. The Ford Interceptor is shows great improvements over the Crown Victoria. It has a 3.5-liter V6 engine, which gets 288 horsepower, compared to the old-style Crown Victoria, which had a 4.6-liter V8 engine, but only attained 250 horsepower. It's all-wheel drive, which is a great asset in New England with tough winters, and is designed specifically from the ground up for police work. It has heavy-duty alternator, heavy-duty brakes, heavy-duty suspension. It's crash-tested for 75-mile-an-hour impacts, both front and rear, and is designed with a protective cage around the officer. It has front side airbags, and is a very safe cruiser to drive. You'll notice one thing about 669, this is what we call a slick top or a semi-marked cruiser. There are no lights on the roof of the vehicle. There's LED lighting, the latest technology in the headliner, on the side windows, the rear, on the mirrors, on the front bumper and push bar. So the vehicle is actually blends in from the front and rear without the lights until they're on. So it's not an unmarked cruiser, but it is a lower profile markings than a traditional cruiser. And again, this is used mainly for traffic enforcement, where the lower profile is desirable. One of the big things you'll notice about the cruisers is the change in the graphics. Chief Brooks decided that with the newer model cruisers would have a change in the graphics, and we've updated to what some people have called a retro look. Other people have called more of a West Coast California type look. But the traditional striping that we've had for many years has been removed, and we've gone back to the very high definition town seal and a very simple Norwood Police design on the door. Again, this sort of looks back towards cruisers of the past, how they look very clean, simple, and it fits well with the new design lines of the cruiser. On the interior of the cruiser, there's a mobile laptop computer, which allows officers to run license plates and wanted subjects without calling it into dispatch. Looking down is the department radio. It's a multi-channel radio, covers our town, all of our surrounding communities, and several regional channels. Below that is the control head for the Whalen light and siren system. All the blue LED lights and the siren are controlled from that box. Just up above that is the control head for the radar unit. There's a mobile radar unit. This allows officers on patrol to acquire vehicles on radar if they're stationary or moving, if they're coming towards the cruiser or going away from the cruiser while the cruiser's moving or while the cruiser's stationary. It can track vehicles on radar for speed enforcement. The rear prisoner compartment on the newer cruisers has changed a little bit. We are using what's called a half cage right now. Instead of traditionally having the entire back seat as a prisoner compartment, we've split the back seat in half with a Lexan partition, which essentially allows us to carry one prisoner. It's much safer. If you'll notice, the back seat has been removed and it's been replaced with a molded plastic seat. This serves two purposes. It's easy for us to clean, and also it prevents the prisoner from hiding any contraband that he may have concealed on him in between the seat cushions, as you could do with the older cars. And if you notice on the rear doors of the cruiser, there are no door handles, and it's been replaced just by a simple panel and also some bars that protect the rear window in case of the prisoner attempting to damage anything in the rear of the cruiser. It's very difficult. Okay, the cruiser on the left is a 2013 Dodge Charger. It's car 667. This is the first time the Norwood Police have used Dodges for many years, and the Dodge Charger comes very highly regarded. It's used across the country as a cruiser, used by many agencies in Massachusetts, including the Massachusetts State Police, and it's a very good reputation as a cruiser. It's equipped with a 5.7-liter V8 Hemi engine, which can attain 370 horsepower. It has many police package features on it, including a heavy engine cooling package, heavy-duty suspension, heavy-duty brakes. The brakes are also designed to perform more efficiently in wet weather. This is a more traditional cruiser. It has the traditional lights on the roof, as opposed to the semi-marked cruiser, the Ford. And again, you can see the updated graphics are applied to this cruiser as well. Very clean look, with just the town seal and Norwood Police on it, as opposed to the older striping that you'll see on the Crown Victorias. The interior of the Dodge Charger is very similar as far as the equipment carried. the mobile laptop computer, the in-house radar unit, the Whalen siren and light control head, as well as the police radio. Most of the equipment in here is very similar. The mounting's a little bit different, but it's essentially the same equipment that's in the Ford vehicle you just saw. The cage setup is also the same. It's the half cage as opposed to the traditional open back seat. Again, it has the molded back seats as well, and it's essentially equipped the same.
Hello, I'm Lieutenant Brian Murphy. In this installment of Norwood P.D. Blue in the rear view, we look back to the daring escape of a convicted killer from the custody of corrections officials. It took place in the emergency room at Norwood Hospital on a quiet Labor Day morning 30 years ago. The prisoner, serving a life sentence at Walpole State Prison, was aided by his wife, who smuggled a gun into the emergency room at Norwood Hospital. A brief gun battle ensued as they fled the parking lot of Norwood Hospital. Then they vanished. The incident is still recalled as one of Massachusetts' most dramatic escapes of a desperate criminal, a convicted murderer with nothing to lose. On the day of the escape, Leroy Chasen was a 33-year-old convicted murderer, just 4 years into serving life without parole for the 1977 murder of the 20-year-old son of a Boston police officer. The victim was stabbed to death by Chasen when he tried to make peace between Chasen and a third man who was also stabbed. It occurred during an argument in a park in Quincy. At the time, Chasen was only days out of prison on another violent crime. Leroy Chasen had been in and out of prisons and reform schools since the age of 15. In September of 1967, at the age of 18, Chasen and an accomplice were arrested breaking into a luncheonette in the middle of the night in Somerville. 6 months later, he was arrested with 2 others after Chasen aimed a firearm out of a window and fired once, striking a 15-year-old girl in the face. The bullet, which entered below one eye, traveled downward through the girl's neck and lodged against her spine. She was saved by a team of surgeons at Mass General Hospital. It makes you wonder why, then, he was not in jail 3 years later, in July of 1971, when he and 2 accomplices held up a Somerville drugstore with a gun. Again, Chasen was a leader, and again, he was quick to use violence. When the druggist was slow to respond to Chasen's demands for narcotics, morphine in particular, he was pistol whipped about the head and across the face with a firearm. Finally, in 1978, Chasen was sentenced to Walpole State Prison for life. At a time when dozens of violent criminals, including murderers such as Armand Therian, who was convicted of a double murder in Westwood in 1975, which included the murder of a police officer, prisoners such as Therian were walking away from furloughs and work assignments outside of the Commonwealth's prisons. Chasen appears not to have been a candidate for the program. He was known as a troublemaker within the prison, thus he probably saw that he would have to manufacture his own opportunity to escape. He placed an ad in the Boston Phoenix. Kathleen Ryan, a 40-something divorcee with 6 children, answered the ad, visited him in prison, and within a few weeks married him. She moved to an apartment on South Street in Walpole. By Labor Day, September 6, 1982, they were ready to hatch their plan to spring Leroy from prison. On Saturday, Kathleen Chasen rented bolt cutters from a local hardware store. By Monday morning at 8:30, she had donned a nurse's uniform and appeared at Norwood Hospital's emergency room. She waited for the arrival of an ambulance from the prison. Meanwhile, Chasen complained to his jailers that he was stabbed 3 times in the chest and stomach. The wounds were superficial, but required that he be transported to Norwood Hospital. After the ambulance arrived with Chasen, shackled and manacled, or cuffed at both the ankles and the hands, and guarded by 3 corrections officers, Kathleen Chasen appeared in the treatment room. In the folds of a towel, she carried a .45 caliber automatic. She ordered all in the room to move away from her husband and to get up against the wall. The doctor, 3 nurses, 2 prison guards, and an orderly complied. While she held him at bay, Chasen pulled out his IVs, disconnected himself from the monitors. He told all present, "Sorry people, I've got to go." Still manacled and shackled, he took the gun from his wife and hobbled as they fled the hospital. The third guard and an unarmed hospital guard gave pursuit. Chasen and the corrections officer exchanged gunfire before Chasen and his wife fled in a 1977 Chevrolet Malibu registered to her. The pair abandoned the getaway car a half-mile away and got into a second vehicle that was parked at the Stop and Shop supermarket, which at the time was located at Central Street and Railroad Avenue. The entire patrol shift that morning responded to the hospital and surrounding area. The prisoner and his wife had vanished. The shackles, manacles, bolt cutters were found in the car. Blood was found in the car as well, but it could not be determined whether it was from Chasen's original injuries or if one of the two had been wounded by the guard. In the aftermath, Norwood Hospital immediately notified all corrections agencies that no prisoners would be accepted there. A bulletin was issued nationwide alerting the law enforcement of the escape. It came with a warning that Chasen and his wife were armed and to be considered extremely dangerous. District Attorney William Delahunt urged witnesses who had testified against Chasen in his trial in 1978 to contact the police if they felt endangered. By December, the Chasens had landed in Chicago and Leroy had landed in jail. He was arrested for an armed robbery in a bar and had in his possession a 9mm handgun. Booked under the alias of Frank James, he soon fled after posting bail. By the next year, Leroy Chasen was arrested for stabbing in a notorious crime den of a barroom in Seattle. This time, he used the name of James Joseph Garrity. His loyal bride went so far as to endure a beating at the hands of a friend in order to give Chasen an alibi for the time of the stabbing. She appeared at the police station, battered, bloodied, to tell the Seattle police that he had beaten her. When they had the opportunity, they fled Seattle. The Chasens learned to stay under the radar, him doing odd jobs, her working as a nurse's aide. Who knows how many close calls they had, and how many times someone, a policeman probably, were spared a savage attack. What they didn't bargain for was Fox Television's innovative crime-fighting, fugitive profiling, convict collecting show, America's Most Wanted. Hosted by John Walsh, the outspoken father of a murdered child, and the advocate of victims of crimes, America's Most Wanted premiered in February of 1988. I bet few recall that the very first episode featured the dramatic escape and shootout of Leroy Chasen at Norwood Hospital. The show depicted a reenactment of the escape using actors. It also gave descriptions of Chasen and his wife and showed photographs. While many of the show's captures came quick on the heels of the fugitive being profiled, and usually the capture was effected without violent resistance, Chasen's capture would not be so easy. It wasn't for almost 18 months, and several updates on America's Most Wanted, that the Chasens would be pegged by someone who had seen the show and recognized first Mrs. Chasen and then Leroy. They had relocated to Denver, Colorado, and Kathleen, working again as a nurse, was Leroy's downfall. In September of 1989, Leroy and Kathleen Chasen and their daring escape from state custody at Norwood Hospital was highlighted yet again on America's Most Wanted. He looked like a million other 40-year-old men in 1989. Kathleen, however, was distinctive looking and continued to work in the nursing field. A co-worker of hers called police. Had Chasen left her, he very well could still be free today, or worse, in another prison for another murder. Instead, they had stayed together. Thus, he was home when the Denver field office of the FBI went to check him out. 3 agents employed a ruse, one posing as a jogger trying to find a resident in the neighborhood. When the agents prepared to arrest Chasen, he appeared at the front door having changed his clothing. He now had a firearm concealed in his waist. He came out of his apartment and engaged the agents, firing at them from a kneeling combat stance. He wouldn't be taken alive and wasn't. So ended the violent life of Leroy Chasen, one of the most violent people to pass through Norwood, however briefly, and one of the stars of the very first episode of America's Most Wanted. The widow Chasen was returned to Massachusetts, where she faced charges of aiding a prisoner to escape, firearms possession, and multiple counts of assault by means of a dangerous weapon. She was sentenced to 9 to 10 years in the state-built prison at Framingham. She was out by 1996.
Hi, my name's Steve Begley. I've been a police officer in the town of Norwood for the last 25 years. I grew up here in Norwood. I went to the Prescott School, Junior High South, graduated from Norwood High School in 1983. Like I said, I grew up in Norwood and I've lived here all my life, and also I have 3 great kids. They're all at Norwood High School right now. My oldest son, Ryan, is about to go to Syracuse University in the fall, and that's going to be a great opportunity for him. It's been great watching my 3 kids grow up here in the town that I grew up in. Growing up in Norwood, I had a friend and neighbor, Peter Kelly, who had become a police officer in 1987 and encouraged me to take the police test and join him on the police department. And I did. In September of 1988, I was hired by the Norwood Police Department, started the police academy. I was joined with Tom Stapleton, Dave Papageris, and David Easy. After completing the police academy in the winter of 1988, I was assigned to the impact unit. That was a 2-man vehicle that patrolled the streets of Norwood. The impact unit was also responsible for crime prevention. We would do various crime surveys for homes and businesses. Someone would request a survey for their home or business, and we would go and give them tips on how to prevent possible break-ins to their house, give them tips on alarm systems, cutting down shrubbery, lighting. The crime prevention unit still exists today. You can call the police department and have someone come out and do a survey for your own home or business. And following working with the impact unit, I went to the midnight shift. I worked the midnight shift for several years. In the mid-1990s, we started a bicycle patrol unit, and I was one of the first ones to ride the mountain bike. There were 4 or 5 of us that would go patrol on the streets with the mountain bike, ride around the town, Norwood Center, down South Norwood, various ball fields, interact with the people. We're down here now at the Pete Wall Field at the Balch Elementary School. In 1983, I graduated from Norwood High School. I played baseball at Norwood High School for Coach Pete Wall. In 1994, Coach Wall had asked me to coach the freshman baseball team. And for the next 14 years, I was involved in coaching baseball at Norwood High School, coaching with the freshman, JV, and assistant varsity level. In 2007, I had stopped. I started watching my own son's games. At that point, I was missing too many games coaching. And 2 years ago, Coach Paul Smargidelis from the Norwood Legion team called me up, told me he was starting this junior Legion team, and if I'd be interested in helping out Coach. So I jumped at the opportunity. Myself, Paul Smargidelis, Tom O'Leary, and Jack Gorman started the first junior Legion team here in Norwood, and we end up winning the state championship down in Acushnet, Mass. Winning the state championship allowed us to host the state title game for the next year. And last year in 2012, when I coached the team with Val Feeney, George Hawley, and Dan Harrington, we walked off this field as the state champions. So after coaching the junior Legion team, Coach Kevin Igo from the Norwood High School varsity baseball team called me up and asked me if I'd be interested in getting back into coaching at the high school. And I jumped at that opportunity again, so I've been coaching the junior varsity baseball team at the high school for the last 2 years. So this year, 2013, is my 16th year coaching at the high school. It's great to see all the kids and be involved with the community. Over the years, made so many great friends just through coaching baseball. 2 kids that I have coached have joined me on the police department, Tony Lopes and Chris Flanagan. I know there's at least 5 guys at the fire department that I coached, so it's good to make those friendships, and they've lasted forever. Also, working with the police department has allowed me to interact with the community with a lot of fundraising. We've helped out some organizations. We play the fire department every year in a softball game that helps out the Circle of Hope Foundation, which is a great organization that helps a lot of Norwood families. We play the Patriots in softball and basketball. A lot of money gets donated to different organizations through that. The Norwood Police Department with Lieutenant Brian Murphy and Paul Murphy raise money through the Jimmy Fund. We take care of all the cans that you might see at various convenience stores and stores around Norwood. We collect the money and present a check, usually every year at the Bo Sox Club luncheon, to the Jimmy Fund. The most rewarding part about being a police officer, like I said, is helping out in the community. I grew up here, I've lived here all my life, and through graduating from Norwood High School and coaching baseball for so long, I have so many friends that are still in the town, and when you can help them out, it's a great feeling. And however small or big their problems may seem, to be able to help them out and guide them in some sort of direction, if that's the case, that's the most rewarding part of being a police officer to me.
Our next feature is extended. In fact, it doubles the length of this episode, but it covers a subject which is extremely important, and it focuses on one of our members of whom we're pretty proud. Those of you in our audience who have become, by necessity, experts in such challenges as dealing with loved ones who suffer from depression or alcoholism or prostate cancer or breast cancer will understand that sometimes law enforcement officers become experts in something that they didn't plan on as they started their careers. In this feature, you'll learn that Lieutenant Martin Baker has become an expert in those children and young adults that are diagnosed with autism, or one of the several variants with which it is associated. He started as a policeman almost 30 years ago. You might have guessed, he might have guessed, he'd become an expert in just about anything else. So please pay attention to this next segment and learn how police officers are schooled on how to best respond to the growing numbers of our children with these special needs.
Hello, my name is Lieutenant Martin Baker. I'm a lieutenant for the Norwood Police Department. I'm here to talk to you today about autism. The reason I teach this class is because I have a son with autism. I'm a 28-year veteran of the police department here in Norwood, and my son, my youngest son, Drew, was diagnosed with autism at the age of about 2.5 years old. Drew is now 18 years old. Because of the fact that I have a son with autism and I'm a police officer, I'm given the unique perspective of how to deal effectively with people with autism on service calls. What I'd like to do today is discuss some facets of autism, basically go over some of the training that our officers receive in Norwood regarding service calls with autism. I've taught officers from all over New England a block of instruction in how to effectively resolve service calls dealing with people with autism. I will go through some of what I train these officers on with you today. Because of the high prevalence of autism in society today, currently, from the latest CDC numbers, 1 out of every 50 births in this country today will be diagnosed on the autism spectrum. Because of this number, there's a high likelihood that as a police officer, we will come in contact with persons on the autistic spectrum as either victims, perpetrators, innocent bystanders, or even witnesses to crimes. The best way to start our conversation today is on a clinical definition of autism. What is autism? Autism is a spectrum disorder, often referred to as ASD, autism spectrum disorder. It's a developmental disability that usually appears during the first 3 years of life. Autism is a neurological disorder that impacts the following areas: social interactions, communication and language skills, and behavior. Again, autism is a spectrum disorder, so that allows for varying levels of functioning within the disorder. Here are the 5 general categories of autism. Autism, language and communication deficits with challenging behavioral traits. Childhood disintegrative disorder, which is a complete loss of language at age 2 with little subsequent improvement. Rett syndrome. 90% of those affected with Rett's are female, and they're multiply and severely disabled. PDD, or PDD-NOS, which stands for Pervasive Developmental Disorder, or Pervasive Developmental Disorder Not Otherwise Specified. This is a combination of traits from other categories. And the final category is Asperger's syndrome, which typically will present as individuals with a high intellect and high verbal abilities, but still lack common social skills. Some autism facts. Nearly 2 million people live with autism in the United States today. 1 out of every 50 people born today will be diagnosed with autism. Autism spectrum disorder is growing at a rate of about 10 to 17% per year. The statistics in Massachusetts, as revealed by studies done, a study done in 1992 to 1993 shows 550 diagnoses of autism within the Commonwealth. This study was again performed in 2003-2004, at which time 4,007 cases of autism were diagnosed. As you can see, this is a huge increase. This represents a 729% increase. Autism knows no racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic boundary, but it does, however, affect males far more often than females. It's 4 times more prevalent in males than females. There's no known cause of autism. However, it's generally thought to be triggered by abnormalities of the brain structure or function. Again, there are no known causes of autism. However, there are a number of theories, many of which you may have heard. Here are some of the most common theories for autism. A link between hereditary and genetics, and there is a lot of evidence of a hereditary link with autism because as we go forward, we're seeing more and more diagnoses within family groups. A family of 4 or 5 children may actually have 2 children diagnosed on the spectrum. An inherent susceptibility to autism spectrum disorder. Some other theories include environmental chemicals and immunizations. One common theory that has been in the media many times over the last several years is the ingredient thimerosal, which is a preservative to vaccines that are given to our children at young ages. Specifically, the one that comes to mind is the MMR vaccine. The MMR vaccine has this additive of thimerosal, which has a mercury component to this additive, and thimerosal is essentially a preservative to give that vaccine a longer shelf life. And there is a mercury component which may, or certainly is suspected of possibly having a link to autism. Problems during pregnancy and delivery, if the mother had problems during the delivery, such as the baby not breathing quickly or some type of complication at birth, may have contributed to the diagnosis of autism. Some type of viral infection or metabolic imbalance, possibly to the mother or the fetus. Again, there's no known cause for autism, so these are theories and theories only. And to date, there is no known cure for autism. So how is autism diagnosed? Well, there's no blood test, MRI, X-ray, CAT scan, or anything like that that will determine autism. So the way it is diagnosed is based on a series of observations of communication, behavior, and developmental levels by a team of clinicians. Who makes this diagnosis? Well, as I stated, it's a multidisciplinary team of clinicians, which will include the following: neurologist, a psychologist, a developmental pediatrician, a speech therapist, as well as an occupational therapist. What happens with this diagnosis is each one of those professionals will do their segment of examination with the child, and at the end of their examination, they'll meet with the team, they'll present a report to the parents, and basically the last paragraph in that 1-inch thick binder of that report will state that the child has autism. At least that's the way it was for my wife and I when my son Drew was diagnosed. A few common characteristics for autism. It is important to remember that every person on the spectrum is affected by autism in a different way, though certain similarities do exist. People with autism, or people with autism spectrum disorder, are prone to wandering and often seek out water sources. They will seek out those water sources regardless of whether or not they know how to swim. In fact, drowning is the leading cause of death for individuals with autism. 50% of all people with autism are nonverbal. One way to communicate with people on the spectrum that are nonverbal are with these PEX cards, as illustrated here. This PEX card is a basic first responder type of card. It shows some symbols that are basic symbols that will help an officer in eliciting the information from a nonverbal person with autism, or even I've used these cards in the past for dealing with children that were non-English speaking, and I was able to get some form of communication through by using these PEX cards. These can be developed for any certain circumstance. Again, these cards that are shown here are for first responders, but they can be tailored to meet the needs of a school system or a hospital setting or what have you. Another thing to remember about autism is that individuals with autism are very much affected by sensory stimuli. Loud noises and other sensory stimuli can overwhelm people with autism and cause a sensory overload. Our sirens, for instance, is a sensory overload for somebody with autism and may cause that person's skills, what skills they do have, to regress dramatically. It's common for people with autism to have a seemingly inappropriate reaction to a situation, a command, or body language. I often give an example in my classes of this. I remember about 10 years back when my son Drew was in elementary school. He was in the playground during recess, and a little girl came running across the playground and tripped and fell directly in front of my son and skinned her knees and started crying. My son Drew pointed at her and started to laugh hysterically. Now, this is a good example of an inappropriate reaction to a situation. Where this can be a challenge for police officers is if we were to respond to the scene of a suspicious fire. We may be suspicious of arson here at this fire. And a crowd would gather, and you might see an 18-year-old walking around watching this fire as it burned with a big grin on his face and seem to get a lot of excitement and enjoyment from seeing this fire. A misread that the average police officer or arson investigator may make is that that individual might be responsible for the fire, when it may very well be a neighborhood child or teenager with autism that came out and saw that and would have that inappropriate reaction to that situation to see the fire. And that's where that's part of the challenge of dealing with people with autism, from a police perspective, because many things that people with autism do, people on the spectrum, can lead us to believe that they have, that the situation is something other than what it appears. So how do we recognize someone with autism spectrum disorder? Well, there's a number of ways to do that. There are some common speech patterns. And again, no two people with autism, like no two people without any disability, are alike. But there are some commonalities. And these are two very common speech patterns within the autism spectrum. Many people with autism will simply repeat words that have been spoken to them before. That's known as echolalia. A police officer, for instance, may pull up on the scene of a teenager in a park after 11 o'clock at night, and the park closes at 9, and shout out to the teenager, "Hey, what are you doing here? It's after 9. That teenager, if he has autism, may say right back, "What are you doing here?" And the officer may respond in kind, "What's your name?" Well, that teenager may say, "What's your name?" to the police officer. And there you can see how that could complicate an encounter between police and somebody with autism if they don't identify that there's a disability like autism at work here. Many people with autism will often just repeat phrases that they've learned in the past. That's a process known as scripting. Another example of my son, based on that incident in the playground I described earlier, we spoke with my son and we tried to tell him and counsel him that, Drew, it's really not nice to laugh when people cry. So to this day, 10 years later, one of Drew's scripts is, it's not nice to laugh when people cry. He may initiate a conversation with somebody who he does not know, and meet them for the first time and say, "Hi, my name's Drew. It's not nice to laugh when people cry." And that's where that came from. Of course, the above shouldn't be confused, none of this should be confused with comprehension of our words or commands. When people do communicate through the use of echolalia and scripting, oftentimes communication is not truly occurring, although there is language. Speech. Again, as I've stated before, up to 50% of the population with autism are nonverbal. But those who are verbal on the spectrum will have limited speech and struggle to express themselves, especially in stressful situations. When I teach my class, I often go over this repeatedly. People in general, when we're called to a scene as police officers, oftentimes we are going to scenes dealing with people during what is a crisis in their lives, not their best day oftentimes. And that's what we do in my profession. We handle a lot of crises, and that's when we're supposed to be calm. Now, people in a crisis, people that don't have a disorder like autism, their skills regress dramatically when they're under stress, just your average person. Their skills and their ability to communicate and reason regresses under extreme stress. You can only imagine how somebody on the autistic spectrum would regress if they're under stress, because they struggle to begin with to communicate because of this disability. And when you introduce stress into the mix, it's going to have their skills regress even that much more rapidly. People with Asperger's syndrome, which is the highest functioning of the disabilities on the autism spectrum, they appear to be more verbally sophisticated, but they'll still lack comprehension capabilities. Maybe very intellectual, some of these people with Asperger's, but may lack some, what you might refer to as some common sense and some common basic understandings. One thing to look for with autism is body language. Those with autism oftentimes will appear to be poor listeners. They'll oftentimes make little to no eye contact. This is another challenge for police because oftentimes A police officer will read an individual who refuses to make eye contact with them during a line of questioning as being deceitful or lying to them. That would be a misread when dealing with somebody with autism, because somebody with autism, due to their disability, will oftentimes make little or no eye contact with an individual who's speaking to them. They often will display a flat facial expression, and they'll have difficulty interpreting your body language. People with autism are concrete learners. Abstract concepts are very difficult for them to grasp. So they are very basic and concrete, and the way you should speak to somebody with autism is in very direct terms. And again, those with autism may have an inappropriate reaction to the situation at hand. Some of their body movements, they may have the following: unusual pattern or balance. My son walks on the balls of his feet. He has boundless energy, and he's always in motion, which is very common with autism. Those with autism will constantly be moving, or they're prone to repetitive actions such as spinning objects, rocking back and forth, flapping their hands, or pacing, or just basically always in motion. It's a very common sign of autism. And they tend to wander around without reacting to their surroundings. Individuals with autism will display a hypersensitivity to lights, sounds, smells, touch, and even animals. They'll also display a little sense of pain. My son and many that I've met on the spectrum have a very high threshold of pain. The little regard for personal safety or some of the common fears, the healthy fears, if you will, that we may exhibit will not be present with somebody with autism, such as crossing the street. Someone with autism may not realize cars are speeding by and may focus in on something on the opposite side of the street and go directly across the street after it with little or no regard for their own personal safety. So, having this all in mind, what's the best way to approach a person with autism? Well, these PEX cards that I showed earlier, that's a good way to communicate with somebody on the spectrum that's nonverbal. So it's good to have. I've passed them out to my officers. I give them out at my trainings. It's a good item to have in your cruiser bag with you. And again, I've used these to communicate with non-English speaking children. Use calm, simple language when dealing with somebody with autism. Be very literal and specific. Again, people with autism are very concrete learners and do not understand abstract thoughts. Even expressions that you may use, such as, "Are you pulling my leg?" Somebody with autism may actually come up and try to pull your leg. So do not use slang or expressions or anything like that. Be very literal and specific as to what you're questioning. Avoid slang words like stated. Some nonverbal people with autism communicate with sign language instead of or in addition to the PEX picture cards. People with autism are prone to repetitive behaviors. Never try to stop these repetitive behaviors unless it's self-injurious or dangerous to others. Allow the person to finish the behavior, because this is self-stimulating behavior, or what is known as stimming, and can be self-soothing. The person with autism can actually calm themselves down after they go through their stimming. So again, if you can allow it to continue, do so if this is not injurious behavior to the person with autism or anybody around them. Avoid touching or standing behind the person. They're prone to lunge or make sudden movements. So if you're directly behind them, you may get the back of their head into your nose, and I've seen it happen. Also be aware of the possibility of bolting. For lack of a better term, I use bolting or running away. People with autism are very prone to run away. I recall a service call a few years ago to a group home in Norwood where there were a number of young adults with autism. And we were actually there for one of the other adults with autism, but I could see when we were talking to the counselors that there was this young girl, about 15 years old, and she just had that look in her eye, and I knew that she was going to run. And we were on the front lawn of this group home, which was on a busy street in Norwood, and I had the responding officer that was there with me. I told her just to make sure she keeps herself between the young girl with autism and the street, because I just sensed that this girl was going to run. And again, from what we discussed earlier, she would most likely display little regard for her personal safety and run directly into the street. The officer I was with, she understood what I was saying. She wasn't sure why I thought that, but sure enough, moments later, this young girl, without any type of notice or without telegraphing her moves in any way, shape, or form, just decided to run, and she made a beeline towards that busy street. Luckily, the officer I had with me was in position to intercept her and just stop her from running out onto the street, and she was able to just kind of corral her and keep her safe, which occurred. But you could see how, if this young girl was allowed to run out into the traffic and was hit by a car, how tragic that would have been. It's just a good example of how people with autism both wander and they tend to run, and maybe right into the path of danger. As police officers, we have to be aware of a condition known as hypotonia. Somebody with autism, people with autism, usually have underdeveloped trunk muscles, which may cause them to be unable to support their airway if they were lying flat. If somebody with autism was lying flat or was restrained for any reason, or they were laying down, the weight of their body could actually shut their airway down. So in the event that if there was an aggressive individual with autism that needed to be secured, we'd have to be aware of this condition, so that would make sure that we could keep their airway open. As I discussed earlier, it's important to remember that stressful situations or upsetting situations overwhelm people with autism, and it's going to adversely affect them. Even the skills they do have will regress quickly once you add stress into the mixture. So how do we avoid unfortunate situations when dealing with people on the autistic spectrum? Well, every year there is a number of people with autism that suffer psychological trauma, physical injury, or even death as a result of a lack of understanding. And this has occurred across the country. So what I advise my officers is to be very patient and calm when dealing with somebody with autism. Get all the correct information you can from the caller for the service call, the caregiver. Check your 911 database, see if we've had service calls there before and what other information we can garnish from that. In closing, the goal of the trainings that I give police officers in dealing with people effectively that are on the autism spectrum is to give them some additional tools in assessing the risk of a situation in order to complement but not replace their previous training. Basically, I'm trying to give them more tools for their toolbox. I'm not asking officers to replace other officer safety techniques or self-defense techniques if it escalates to that, but I'm giving them some insight as to the disability known as autism spectrum disorder and some of the behaviors and some of the telltale signs that they could come to expect in certain ways that have been proven successful in dealing with these different behaviors that they may encounter when dealing with the person with autism. It's been successful. We've been able to safely and effectively deal with people on the autism spectrum, much to the delight of the loved ones of these people, including myself. I'm the father of an 18-year-old son with autism, and the more police officers that have been trained in dealing with autism, it makes me feel better at night knowing that if, God forbid, I can't be there at every moment with my son and there's some type of encounter he has with a police officer, that knowing that this type of training and this information is out there and has been given to police officers, and the odds of a successful and peaceful and safe resolution to a service call are much greater if the officer has some training in dealing with autism. Thank you for your time tonight, and have a good day.